Hi everyone, my name is Pranav. If you're new here, welcome, and if you're not, welcome back. Today we're going to be taking a look at part 3 of the Learn Python 2020 course. Today's focus is going to be on functions and modules, which are two very essential parts of Python to any beginner programmer as well as a veteran programmer. Without any further ado, let's jump right on into our PC and start coding. So here we are in our REPL.it online code editor. Let's quickly click the Start Coding button right here in the middle, click Python, and click Create REPL. So now we're in our familiar environment where we can start writing code. And like I said earlier, our two focus topics for today are going to be functions as well as, modules. Let's first look at functions. We've already seen a couple of functions within our code. The first one would be print, and the second one would be input. Let's first examine print to see what a function would look like. Let me quickly stop this code right here. Functions are very similar to what you've heard of probably in math. They usually take in an input and do something with the input and output something else. There's also other types of functions where they just take in an input and do something and there's no output at all. In this case, print is the one that takes in an input and does something and there's no output. Let me explain why. For print, we usually have to put in a string or some sort of data within these parentheses, and within the parentheses is where the input goes in, similar to a function like f of x as what you would see in math, where the x is the input. But similarly in print, you're going to put the input within the parentheses. Let's say hello world. Very generic, but now if we were to print this, if we were to run this, what our function is doing is printing hello world to the console, but we're not actually getting anything back in the code, if that makes any sense. Let me showcase another example to iterate this concept. Here's the input function. Now this function, unlike the other function, the other print function, input takes in an input. Okay, that's kind of confusing, but input takes in an input right here within the parentheses, which can be some sort of prompt, and it outputs something as well. What I mean by this is, if I were to create a variable, say a, and store this input function within it, whenever this input function runs, it's going to actually take in whatever prompt we add here, or if there's no prompt, it's not going to take any prompt at all. Then it's going to question us right here in the console, and whatever we type right over here, let me quickly run this. Now whatever I type right here, let's say Bob, that's actually going to go back into our code and get stored into A. That means that this input function is actually outputting whatever we're actually using right here. Example Bob right here, but that's going to actually be outputted by this function and get stored into the variable called A. Now that we've seen a clear example of what functions can do, let's create some of our own. We can easily create a function using very similar syntax to what we've been using so far. The first example, let's create a simple function. The way we're going to do this is by first creating a starting point, which is what I call them, but these are basically part of the syntax, which lets Python know what type of statement you're creating. Say if you want to use an if statement, we start it off with if, and if we're creating a loop, we're going to start it off with something like while or for. But for functions, we're actually going to be using def, and what this stands for is define, so that means we're actually going to be defining a function, thus the starting point of def. Okay, maybe it's just def, and then after this we're actually going to have to name our function. For now, I'm just going to call it something like, let's just say H. Not sure why I called it that, okay, but it can be anything you want right here. Then we're going to actually have to use parentheses, and this lets Python know that it's actually a function. And just like in any other statements, you're going to have to add a colon right here, which lets Python know once again that this part right here is the definition statement, and after this is going to be our block of code that's going to actually be executed whenever you're going to run this function. For now, let's say within H, what we want to do is actually call another function called print, And let's say we just want to do print hello. So what this function is going to do is whenever we call h, this function h, it's going to print out hello. Pretty simple for sure, but now let's actually use it real quick. Just as we would with any other function, I can just do this h and then these two parentheses, the one forward facing and one backward facing, and now if I were to run, it works just as expected and we see hello in the console. Now first off, what if we wanted some sort of input? The way that's going to work is by modifying what's inside of these parentheses right here. Let's actually create a bit more of a complex function. Say we want to print out the addition of a number with an existing number, I guess. That kind of didn't make sense. Let me explain that real quick. So what we're going to do is add whatever the input is to 10 and print that out. Pretty simple, right? So the way we're going to do this is by first getting input, and we're going to actually have to modify these parentheses in our definition right here. We should add a variable which is going to designate the input that you're expecting. In this example, I'm going to create just a variable called a. And here within our print function, I'm going to print out 10 plus a. Now this might seem a bit complex, but within the definition of a function and within the parentheses after the identifier slash name of your function, you're going to put in the inputs that you're expecting. So Python knows that, oh, add is actually going to be expecting a variable or an input, and it automatically assigns that input to the variable called a, so you can use it within your function. Let's see how this works now. Inside of the calling of our function add, I'm going to add in a number, say 34. And now our add function is actually going to add 10 to 34 and print that out. If I click run, we should see 44, which is exactly what we expected. That's great. What if we wanted to do two inputs instead? Well, that works just as easy. All we need to do is separate them by a comma. Say we want two inputs, a and b. You just separate them by a comma in the definition, and we would need to do the same when we're actually going to be using our function as well. Right here, let's say I wanted to add 34 and 76, or 76, sure. And right here, when we're printing them out, I don't want to actually print 10 plus a, but I want to print a plus b instead. So this function is actually just going to be adding two numbers. And wait, you might be thinking, what is the point of this when I could just do print a plus b, or print 34 plus 76, instead of doing this function sort of example right here? That's a good point, but this is just for example purposes, and you're probably not going to be using a very simple function like this in the real world. We're just using this as an example to see how functions work and how you can create them. Now, back to the example. Now if I were to run, it's going to actually add 34 plus 76, and we get our expected result, 110. Next, let's look at how we're going to actually use input within our function as well. We just did input. Let's see how we're going to use output within our function as well. Let's say instead of printing this out right here, we want to actually return some sort of data, and that's going to go back right here, and so we can actually store that value within a variable. Say we want to store sum equals, actually I probably shouldn't call it sum, let's say I call it equal, sure. That's a bad variable name, but it doesn't really matter what you call it. So we're going to actually create this variable called equal and assign it to the value of add 34, 76, which is our function call with these two inputs. But right now, within our function, we're not actually returning anything. And what I mean by return is we would need to actually return some value, which when this function is called, it's going to go back right here and substitute for this value so it can get stored within the variable. Let me showcase that with an example. Just like we did in the input function, we didn't create that, but when we use it, it's going to actually ask the user for some input right here, and whatever we type, it's going to get returned back to the code, back to where the input function is called, and get stored within the variable that you're storing it to. We're going to do the same thing here by using a new phrase or a new starting point or of sorts, new syntax, and that's going to be called a return. So you can use this within functions to return data values back to wherever the function is being used. In this case, we want to return a plus b, and what this is going to do is return a plus b, really. Let's see an example of this by printing out equal after we've used the function. If this works, what's going to happen is, first off, it's going to actually execute this line first. Equals add 3476. Now that's going to go over to the definition of the function, substitute in a equals 34 and b equals 76. Then it's going to actually return 34 plus 76. So that's going to go back here, and Python's going to do this, but it's going to just overrule this function definition right here and just say 34 plus 76 right here instead, and that's going to be 110. So this value is just going to get substituted for 110, and then we're going to print that out. But Python handles all of this behind the scenes, so we don't have to worry about ourselves about that actually. Now, so if I run, we see our exact result just as we expected. So great, our function works. I think that's a good enough beginning guide, I guess, to functions. You feel free to explore this more on your own. Like, you can substitute these numbers with some strings or add more inputs and do more within your function. Say, we don't only want to just return something. We want to actually do a bit more complex operation by doing something like c equals a star b star 10, and then do something else with it, and all of that. You can do anything you want within the function's definition. Now let's move on to modules. Well, what are modules? Modules, like I said at the start, are very essential to any programmer who's using Python, really. They allow you to do a lot more than what Python allows you to do just with Python. What I mean by this is a lot of people behind Python have created a bunch more of code that you might want to use within your projects and your programs. But I mean, not everyone wants to use the same module, same code, so they don't include all of them within Python. But if you want to use them, you can, just by using these modules. Let me showcase an example. Say you wanted to use more complex math syntax, math functions, like you want to do something like square root or factorial. There's a really easy way to do this through the module math. We can use the module by typing out import. So we're going to actually be importing module, and we're going to actually import the module math right here in this example. So what this means is Python's going to look at this and be like, okay, the developer wants to use all of the functions, variables, and all of the code included within the math module. So they're importing it right here. So thus we can just use all of the modules right within our code now. All of the code within math right within our code now. Now to actually use this, say we wanted to print it out. Let's just do that. All we have to do is type out the module's name, then add a dot right there, and we can actually access all of the functions that are within math right now, as well as some variables. See, we can get pi, nan, e, and that sort of thing, which are variables related to math. And you can also do things like log or sine, cos, tan, the trigonometry things, remainder, radians, power. There's a bunch of stuff here that you might want to use. For example, let's look here and get factorial, and all we need to do is just add parentheses just as with any other function. And so here, yeah, you want to find x to the factorial of x. You can do so simply by typing out the number you want to find the factorial of, say 6, which should be 720. Now if I were to run this, you would get 720 just as expected, and thus we've actually used a function within our module. Very simple. We can also use other functions within math just as we did here. Let's say we want to use, let's look here. Okay, let's say we want to do log 10. Let's say we want to find log 10 of 1,000 or 10,000, sure. And that should be 4, just as we expected. We got 4. Great. We could do something other than that as well, but I'm not going to explore through every function within math right now. let's move on to another key module, which is going to be random. Random is used when you want the computer to decide something, really. This can be used as a place of artificial intelligence, or in random games, or when you just don't want to make the choice yourself and want to leave it up to the computer to decide. Like I said, this could be anything from like deciding how many hit points a user gets, or making like a random number guessing game. Let's just showcase a couple of uses. The most important function you're going to be using within random is going to be randint. We can access this function the same way we did within the math module. And first off, we're going to have to type out the module's name, just as we did with math. In this case, it's going to be random. Then add a dot. And this dot actually lets Python know that you're going to access all of the functions within random. So if you add the dot, we automatically get a view filled with all of the functions within random right here. And this is the one we're looking for, randint. Now if I type this out and add some parentheses, it automatically tells me how I can use this. Randint allows you to return a random integer within a set range. In this case, let's say I want to find a random integer from 1 through 10. I could do so just as easy as this. And now if I were to run, I would get a random number right here, 1 through 10, 6. And to prove that this is actually random, if I run again, I'm going to get a different number, hopefully. See, I got 5. I mean, it's all random, so there's still a chance you could get the same number, but it's just, most of the times it's going to be different. So it can be used a lot, like, let's say you want to make a random number guessing game, as I said earlier. This can be used frequently for such purposes. Now, since I changed it to 1 through 100, it's going a lot higher. But I think that's a good overview of how you're going to be using modules within Python. This is just an overview of showcasing what sort of modules exist, what are modules, and how you can actually access functions within modules. But there's a lot more modules that you can actually use. Things like turtle for time, and things like date, I think, or that sort of things, or calendar related things. And you can learn a lot more by just searching online. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I think that's where we're going to end off today. We're going to be going over part 4 tomorrow, or in the future soon, which is going to cover arrays and a lot more about array manipulation. And we're going to end off with part 5, as I said earlier. But yeah, that's about it for this video. Thank you so much for watching till the end. Be sure to subscribe to my channel if you like these videos, and be sure to like this video as well if you enjoyed it. Make sure to hit that bell icon right next to the subscribe button if you enjoyed it and you want to get updates whenever I upload a new video. But that's about it. Thank you for watching, and cheers.